Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hey, Judah.
We'll be talking about U.S. President Donald Trump's upcoming visit to India and relations between the world's two biggest democracies. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Raul Gallegos about how Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has managed to hold on to power despite an economic and humanitarian crisis at home and the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign abroad. Freddie, as I mentioned in the intro, Donald Trump is heading to India next week for a 2-day visit. Given his aversion to travel, it's possible he'll back out at the last minute. But if he does end up going, given their past interactions, it's safe to assume Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi will put on a display of camaraderie.
That's for sure. There's apparently a big event planned at a still being putting the finishing touches on it, a giant cricket stadium that Trump and Modi are apparently going to inaugurate in Modi's hometown. It apparently can hold something like 110,000 people. I think Modi is probably the only foreign leader who can really compete with Trump and his obsession with crowd size, and maybe even spark some jealousy in Trump. When Modi visited the U.S. last year, he held this huge rally in Houston under the tagline "Howdy Modi," speaking to the huge Indian community that is in Houston. And Trump was apparently very impressed with the crowd size, and I think sort of the sell from the Modi government to Trump is that if he comes to India, Modi will sort of do that, but on an even bigger scale, and sort of shower Trump with cheering crowds and the sort of spectacle that Trump is so obsessed with.
In a lot of ways, and I'm not the first to point this out, the two leaders share some similarities. They both appeal to a nationalist, identitarian base. With Modi, in Modi's case, it's the Hindu nationalists. In India, Trump obviously has that sort of anti-elitist, resentment and grievance-based politics in the U.S. They're both very business-friendly. And in some ways, in terms of trade, even though there are some tensions between the two sides in terms of the trade imbalance in India's favor, India is somewhat protectionist when it comes to trade. They recently backed out of the RCEP, the trade agreement in Asia that's being negotiated, and the finishing touches put on that. So in some ways, it's not really surprising that they share this kind of friendship that Trump often seems to seek with very popular and somewhat authoritarian leaders abroad, even if he doesn't with America's traditional allies.
Right, and I think in terms of the trade tensions, the U.S. also last year stripped India of special trade privileges that had given India special market access to the U.S. For years. So sort of under the surface here as well, there's the threat of looming further trade tensions and, if not an outright trade war. That's something that Kim Elliott has pointed out in her column over the last year or so, that India could be the new front in Trump's trade wars. It sort of checks all the boxes of the sort of grievances that Trump has with certain economies. A country like India that enjoyed sort of some of the trade privileges given to developing markets in terms of export duty-free access to the U.S. But then, obviously, as India's economy has grown, Trump feels like that's deeply unfair to the U.S., that it's taking advantage of the U.S. And these tensions, we see them mirrored with China as well, that Trump thinks that these large economies, even if India obviously is still a developing country and has major issues to deal with in terms of its economic development, poverty, etc., Trump thinks that it is a big enough economy that it doesn't deserve any special treatment from the U.S. in his mind. And so I think that what we'll see certainly on this tour of India is, behind these big rallies and spectacles, and a lot of the sort of love that Modi is trying to show Trump, there'll be questions about what's actually happening behind the scenes and whether this is all masking tariffs to come or some other escalation.
Modi might do well to have a call with Shinzo Abe, the Japanese prime minister, with regard to how useful it is to sort of nurture that personal relationship with Trump. It didn't seem to do Abe very much good in terms of some of the trade talks with the U.S., and Modi might end up being a little disappointed. At the same time, Modi couldn't really hope for a better U.S. president when it comes to the U.S. position on some of his more controversial domestic policies, and especially this creeping illiberalism with regard to religious minorities in India. A recent law that fast-tracked citizenship for non-Muslim asylum seekers and migrants, that was basically meant to plug the gaps on a recent effort to strip citizenship from people who had originally come from Bangladesh to northeastern India. They had a citizenship registry to that effect, and the problem was that there were actually a lot of non-Muslims that ended up not being able to prove their citizenship. So they had this sort of fast-track law to plug the gaps in that, and it caused a huge amount of outrage within India and also abroad. Probably unlikely we'll hear Trump or the Trump administration take him to task for that. So in some ways, Trump is almost like a U.S. president that Modi could only dream of. But at the same time, the visit comes at an interesting moment in the broader trajectory of U.S.-India ties. Similarly, the Trump administration has really courted India to continue this appeal to try to enlist it into America's strategic planning for Asia. You saw the Trump administration dust off these plans for what's known as the Quad, which is a quadrilateral defense dialogue and cooperation group between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India. And they renamed the Pacific Command. It's now the Indo Pacific Command to extend to the Indian Ocean. And at the same time, India, that might put India on the spot because they've got pretty complex relations with China. But in a lot of ways, those moves are very clearly meant to enlist India into an anti-China coalition that India doesn't really want any part of.
No. And I mean, on the one hand, the sort of vaunted Indo-Pacific strategy that the Trump administration announced seemed like a perfect example of this disconnect between the White House and the Pentagon. During this administration, there was what seemed like a fairly traditional rollout in terms of rebranding this strategy, having policy papers and defense officials meeting with counterparts in the region to try to, make this a U.S. foreign policy priority. And, I can't recall Trump ever even mentioning the phrase Indo-Pacific. He doesn't seem to have even any idea that this is sort of part of his administration's foreign policy strategy in Asia. So there's, on the one hand, this disconnect between very, substantive defense policy and strategy goals that Washington has been trying to prioritize, and then obviously Trump's own priorities and thinking. But I also think that, on top of that, there's also other tensions. India has done a good job of playing sort of as many sides as it can for years. That's sort of been India's traditional foreign policy position of balancing its ties with China, never really being fully on one side or another. Obviously, going back to the non-aligned movement, India was really sort of, the chief non-aligned country, I guess we can say that. But recently, India defied pressure from the U.S. and signed a missile defense deal with Russia. So I'm sure that might also come up in some form. And so I think that the disconnect there between, this U.S. defense strategy and then Trump's stated aims sort of fits into that as well. That, you sort of wonder, what priority Trump will put on this Indo Pacific strategy if it even comes up in any of his meetings with Modi or other Indian officials, and also really how much attention India wants to give to it itself. I'm sure they're happy to host American defense delegations and, hopefully, get closer to the certain sorts of defense deals that they want for India's sake, but also, they're balancing that alongside other deals they're making, in this case, with Russia, but other countries too.
Yeah, you mentioned India's historical non-aligned policy, but they were also very historically suspicious of America due to U.S. ties with Pakistan. And during the Cold War, bought weapon systems from the Soviet Union, and after the Cold War from Russia. You mentioned diversifying their defense ties. They signed a pretty big ticket contract with France for fighter jets. And so they've always had this multi-vectoral foreign policy, and things began to change with regard to the U.S. There were also tensions over India's nuclear weapons program, and beginning in 2006, I believe it was, and the George W. Bush administration, which entered into the USIndia civil nuclear deal and began normalizing India's place in terms of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and its ability to sort of have an unrecognized weapons status, but not be excluded from civil nuclear trade around the world. And that was really seen as a real watershed moment, and was clearly seen as part of this full court press to enlist India as a strategic counterweight to China. We saw the Obama administration pursue that and make quite a bit of gains, but India always had a number of misgivings. First of all, the U.S., with regard to weapons deals, is notoriously stingy when it comes to tech sharing and tech transfer, and with regard compared to, for instance, Russia or France, for that matter. So there were some misgivings there. But I think the major misgiving is that as much as India might be concerned and worried about China's rise, they share a very long border, some parts of which are still disputed, and along other parts they've had recent tensions, and so India just can't really afford to be have a declarative policy of being part of an anti-China coalition. And so it'll be interesting, like you said, to see to what degree Trump is even aware of this issue. But I think that it does sort of point to this broader theme and organizing logic in the Trump administration's foreign policy, and it's something that Europe faces, Africa faces. We saw it during Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's recent visit to the Munich Security Conference, and then a 3-country Africa tour that followed it. Is this effort that the U.S. And pressure U.S. is putting on its partners to basically choose between the U.S. and China when it comes to Huawei and 5G or the trade war, and even there, you have a little bit of discord and incoherence because you have the Trump administration saying one thing and then Trump arguing against, for instance, prohibiting sales of tech and airplane engines to China. So there's a little inconsistency within the administration. But even so, Europe made it very clear they don't want to pick a side, Africa either, because they depend on China for so much financing. And I think that's something we're likely to see in terms of India.
Yeah, there isn't any incentive, it seems, from any of these countries, whether they're close U.S. allies in Europe or, partner countries in Africa or here in India's case, that they're not going to go so far. They don't have any incentive to go so far to accede to the Trump administration's demands and reject Chinese tech and not sign deals with Huawei. There isn't enough incentive from the U.S. to go fully in that direction. Also, not least because they still want ties with China, either for exports or financing. In the case of African countries, but also, on top of that even if there isn't an incentive from the U.S., also the way that the U.S. has gone about trying to pressure these countries, the way Trump and his administration have done it, has been through threats, through bullying, through tariffs. When Pompeo and the Defense Secretary Mike Esper were in Munich for last week's security conference, I think they both, whether in their addresses or in other interviews, mentioned, that essentially that U.S. intelligence sharing would be at risk if these countries went ahead, if Germany and France and other European countries went ahead with allowing Huawei into infrastructure markets in those countries in the same way that the British government recently announced. I think that those countries all have responded with shrugs, essentially. That I think also that the problem is that, again, those incentives, the incentives aren't there, and then the demands are so sort of unyielding and unrealistic that you're not going to convince anybody to go along with that. And so I think that Trump, in this odd way, is a little more realistic than some members of his own cabinet, because he is, again, but with his inconsistency, being, suggesting, oh, well, maybe we could still, sell these, important industries and exports to China, even though he's, engaged in a major trade war. And I think that in that way, unintentionally so, Trump is more realistic and sort of open-minded, if you could say that, about just the different interests that these countries are balancing.
It's a fascinating experiment in some ways, because over the past 15, 20 years, and especially with China's rise, we've seen such an economically interconnected world where there's no such thing really as a Chinese product or an American product, or even for that matter, European product, things like that, which is why so many of these trade deals now have very complex percentage formulas for rules of origin, because the supply chains and the supply lines for any given product are so complex and cross so many borders. And so within the U.S., even you have various constituencies, U.S. businesses that are very tied into China are kind of hoping for a more conciliatory position. I think the national security establishment is somewhat divided, because they see China as a strategic competitor. At the same time that I don't think anyone really wants to envision open conflict between the two countries. And then it's interesting what you said, that Trump, in his inconsistency, kind of resembles some of the American partners that the U.S. is trying to pressure to decouple from China. He kind of wants to decouple, but at the same time, when he realizes the real consequences, he wants to maybe backtrack a little bit. And he said, America is open for business. We don't want to make it too hard for American businesses to go out into the world and make money. And so it's interesting, because that America first approach kind of contradicts some of the economic urgencies and even the complexities of where America's national interest really lies. And I think something like a multi-vectoral foreign policy approach, like India's, really illustrates the challenges that the United States will have if it does try to pressure countries to adopt a you're with us or against us either or line, a sort of new Cold War with China. It's hard enough to try to get all of the United States on board with that, but then to try and get a country like India or countries in Africa, like you said, or even Europe, where they depend on trade with China so much, to get on board with that, I think would be is close to impossible. So again, we'll see the degree to which it even enters into Trump's consciousness on this trip, which is more likely to be theatrics more than anything else. But in terms of U.S. policy with India, and it's that long-standing attempt to kind of enlist India into these strategic plans, I think that's almost like a canary in the coal mine for this broader campaign campaign to organize things around a contain China or counter China line.
Yeah, and it's also a sign, too, I think, of how much more India matters geopolitically now, that the U.S. is so concerted in trying to enlist India to sort of come along to its side, and how central India is to the U.S. hopes of containing China. Whether India will go along with it is another question, but I think it does show how between India's economic rise and just other developments in recent years, India is, much more central geopolitically, not just in South Asia, but for U.S. strategy in Asia more broadly. And that's certainly, something that people have been sort of waiting in the same way that China's rise was, being followed closely. The question has always been, will India compete with China? Will it be able to even potentially to overtake China or to compete with it economically, just given the size of the country itself? And I think that it's certainly not there yet, but I think it is clear that India matters more and more geopolitically.
All right, time to flag some WPR articles for everyone listening. Which one did you have in mind?
A briefing from Istanbul by Claire Bush reporting on a massive infrastructure project, a multi-billion-dollar canal, essentially digging a new Bosporus Strait that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan made central to his last re-election campaign in 2018, and is trying to plow forward with the canal. But it has been sparking an unexpected amount of resistance in Turkey, including from the recently elected mayor of Istanbul, who has essentially become the leader of the opposition in Turkey. And so the fight over this canal is not just an environmental one, but is increasingly one that represents a growing political fault line in Turkey.
All right, and I'll mention a briefing by Josie LeBlond on the turmoil gripping Germany's Christian Democratic Union Party after Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer unexpectedly resigned as party chief last week. AKK, as she's known, was Chancellor Angela Merkel's hand-picked successor as head of the CDU, which would have made her the party's candidate for chancellor in next year's elections. Merkel has already announced she won't run next year as part of a gradual succession plan hatched after her disappointing showing in 2017 elections. With those plans now in upheaval, the CDU must reconcile its centrist and conservative wings, even as it sheds voters to both the far right and far left, particularly in the former communist East. Okay, two things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected articles and a rundown of everything else we've published, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount if you decide you'd like to take the next step and subscribe to WPR. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? What do you got for me, Freddy?
All right, I'm going to take out the name of the country in question in the quote. Here it is. The root cause of all these problems and issues is that the U.S. does not want to see the rapid development and rejuvenation of this country, and still less would they want to accept the success of a socialist country.
That's a tough one. I want to say either Venezuela or I got to say Venezuela.
It is actually China.
China. I was about to say Venezuela or China.
China's foreign minister responding to Esper and Pompeo and their speeches at the Munich Security Conference last week.
Okay, here goes mine. I'm going to blank out two references to the country. The blank people do not welcome media that publish racist statements and smear blank with malicious attacks.
Is this Chinese officials responding to or justifying their kicking out 3 Wall Street Journal reporters over a op-ed that the Wall Street Journal published?
Well done. Ostensibly in retaliation for the headline of an op-ed that ran on the Journal's opinion page. The headline in question was "China is the real sick man of Asia." It referred to the coronavirus outbreak, but referenced a phrase, sick man of Asia, that was associated with the 19th century colonial domination of China. And by coincidence, one of the journals that was expelled was also involved in an investigative report the journal published last year linking Xi Jinping's cousin to accusations of money laundering and organized crime in Australia. So a little fishy there.
I knew that because it was that's a key story in this week's China Note newsletter.
All right. Great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.